Joanne, it's a pleasure to have you back. I'm delighted that we're able to continue this conversation because in thinking about what we spoke about the last time, it became even clearer to me that the key to experiencing Dante as our contemporary is to understand that he lived in a world as complex, as rich, as engaging as ours, but it was different. So can I ask you to talk a little bit more about what you've experienced from the students that you've taught over the years in terms of the things they identify as points of personal contact, relevance, the ongoing appeal of Dante?
Some of it is, has to do with pop culture, and some of it has to do with a sort of deeper understanding that some of the students bring to the text. But I just mentioned pop culture because Dan Brown has come out with Inferno, and the students are also have tended, or many of them have had access to the video games, the animated games where Dante goes through hell with a sword and knocks down his enemies. Some of the students have also taken these online quizzes that tell them, you know, if they answer certain quizzes, what level of hell they'll be at. So it's in pop culture. One of the aspects that they enjoy, and I spend a lot of time on, is the politics. Because of course, politics and factional politics resonates today very well.
I think you're very right about that, Joanne, in the sense that there's a fascination because it's not common in our culture for someone who has star quality as an artist also to be intimately involved and influentially and powerfully involved in the politics and have that also spill over into his personal life. So it's kind of this unique combination of aspects that you have a great artist who is also a public figure and an influential public figure that makes his story so compelling and in many ways so traumatizing when you realize where this perhaps somewhat naive, perhaps somewhat ambitious eagerness to be directly involved in the welfare of his city led Dante.
Leonardo Bruni talked about Dante's role in politics and said there was not a decision being made in Florence at that time that Dante did not have a hand in. So even though he only held a position in the priorate for 6 months, he had an outstanding influence on the politics of the period. What is wonderful for the students when they visit Florence is to walk the streets and to notice how close the homes are of the leaders of the two parties. They're literally 2 blocks away. How Dante's house itself was only a very short walk to the Palazzo. To be able to walk the streets and see how intimately everyone would have known one another. And to look at the crenellations on the buildings so that you could see immediately who's Guelph, who's Ghibelline. So I think that, you know, being in Florence and seeing what a small space it is, it gives you again this sense of how intense the political culture was. And since Dante threads his politics through his Divine Comedy, the students get a very good sense of how powerfully that affected him. The other, you know, besides the fact that there was a price on his head, that he lost everything, he spent a lot of his exile in poverty. In one of his letters, he talks about not being able to afford a horse. He also was put in a position of having to beg is perhaps not quite right, but to depend on others. And in his writings to acknowledge the fact that he was dependent upon others. He was at one point communicating with one of his colleagues in Padua with the suggestion that he would receive the laurel, and he refused. He said, I will only receive it in Florence at the foot of the baptistry. And of course, he never got there. So the students are looking at someone who is in exile, impoverished, angry, you know, vindictive in some, and taking on the position of a prophet in his letters, taking on the position of a sacred writer in his Divine Comedy, and taking on a godlike position of judging. And this, it creates an interesting dynamic with the students in terms of how they feel about Dante in watching this enterprise of his.
And at least at a surface level, can appear easily to be very much out of tune with the climate and ethos of our own culture, which superficially at least purports to be very non-judgmental, that tolerance of different points of view and of entirely different outlooks on life, on human existence, on the organization of society, so to be that judgmental, in fact, I'm sure you have encountered the same thing I have, that the very idea for some readers and for some students of Dante deciding who's going to be in hell and who's going to go to heaven is absolutely repugnant. Yes. Isn't that the height of the hubris that you were talking about?
But on the other hand, he's also attacking the church's ability to a stated ability to determine who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. I mean, he has excommunicate. His first, Manfred is excommunicate, and he's in purgatory. He's got Pope Celestine the Fifth in hell, and Pope Celestine was canonized by the time Dante was writing. So, he is doing this in part to show an alternative form of judgment from the church. That in and of itself suggests a very high level of hubris.
Yes.
On the other hand, there is that aspect of him where you've got Rahab in paradise, and you've got Kunitsa in paradise.
Yes.
Kunitsa married 4 times, had various lovers. Joachim of Fiora, whose views on the Trinity were declared heretical, is in paradise. So you've got a lot of different individuals there that gives this, there's the metaphor that Dante gives in paradise of an ocean in which you walk out and you can only see down to the shore a very small degree, but God sees the rest.
Yeah.
And so at the same time you've got his judgmental quality, you also have this sense of God's mercy and God's knowingness, which is much beyond anything we could ever imagine.
We live in an age now where religion is in many ways become a question again, in the sense of what its role should be. We're more open to diversity of religion probably than at any time in the history of human culture, and yet the question of divisiveness because of religion, conflict between specific groups, the perceived interference of religion into secular spheres of life, all of that leads back to this question of Dante's influence. Do you see a connection between his attitudes on religion and our contemporary world? And then more generally, what would you say continues to be the hold that he has on us as our contemporary?
I think other than, initially when his political views and his religious views struck the church as not completely acceptable, the Divine Comedy, for all of its radicalness, was too popular right away. And so you have commentaries and copies such that by 1500 the text is set and it's beginning to influence. It influenced Botticelli's drawings. It influenced very early on, by the 1340s, I think Nardo di Cioni's drawings in the Strozzi Chapel. So one could almost argue that Dante's vision of the afterlife put its imprint into Italian painting.
Yes.
Yes. After his death. So the text itself and the very concrete imagery attached to it, which is very Renaissance in a way, the way in which he painted pictures with words is almost a precursor to a Renaissance way of looking at things. In the English-speaking world, there were very few. Chaucer knew Dante, and since Chaucer had made visits to Italy at least 3 times in his life, and may well have seen Boccaccio lecture on Dante in the streets of Florence, and Milton picked up on Dante, but there is a sort of a hiatus in the English language, and that all changes in the 19th century. And it's the poets that pick him up first. Byron picks him up, Yeats picks him up, Percy Bysshe Shelley picks him up. So by the second half, certainly by the second half of the 19th century, you have got people who are just enthralled with Dante. Thomas Carlyle, in his book on heroes and heroism, cites only two writers as the greatest heroes of the ages, and those are Dante and Shakespeare.
Yes.
And then as you move into the 20th century with T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Jorge Luis Borges in Argentina.
It's an explosion.
It's an explosion.
Yeah,
Naguib
yeah.
Mahfouz. You know, it's hard to find very many. E.M. Forster, A Room with a View, has a whole sequence on the book that's based on Francesca and Paolo.
Right.
So it's hard to find writers in the 20th century and ongoing into the 21st century who have not been influenced by Dante.
I've always been impressed by the way in which Dante seems to be seminal for an idea that the significance of human freedom and the way in which human freedom, as puny as it is in so many ways, makes a decisive mark in history, and that for every human being who has lived, not just the great folks, but that everybody is viewed as making a mark that's indelible in the history of the whole universe.
And Dante's statement on human freedom was a large statement.
Yes.
The fact that he was such a proponent of free will, both in his Convivio and also in the Divine Comedy throughout, makes the Inferno all the more intriguing because these people have chosen to be there.
Yes.
And that's hard for the students to understand. These people are wanting to be there because they're not going to deviate from who they are.
I think that that brings up something that I think people, genuinely readers, find frightening when they confront it, that people actually can and do make up their minds and decide things finally.
Yes.
I think there's the sense, because it's comforting, that we, everyday life sort of, well, tomorrow's a new day. We can always change our mind, we can always revise later. But Dante, again, it's a testimony to the dignity of the human person. No, no, no. Human beings have the capacity to decide finally.
And in that regard, he puts into this poetic masterpiece the same ideas that Pico della Mirandola talked about in the 15th century that are so typical Renaissance, that man has the capacity to lower himself, herself, to beast or to be with the angels. And this is essentially what Dante has woven for us in his masterpiece.
Without overinflating the claim, I do think it's very important in an appreciation of Dante to recognize the way in which he was fundamental, a kind of a cornerstone in establishing the modern idea of human dignity. That this dignity of conscience, self-determination, that the ultimate freedom is freedom of conscience to decide for yourself what your, not only what your view of reality is going to be, but what your stance toward that reality is going to be.
I agree.